Hi, everyone. It's Danielle, executive editor of Fine Gardening Magazine. Thank you so much for being a loyal podcast listener. We wanted to let you know that we have an amazing holiday deal going on for Fine Gardening Magazine subscriptions. If you're not already a subscriber to Fine Gardening Magazine and you love the podcast, it's a natural fit for you to start subscribing to our print magazine, where we give you all the great plant recommendations that you hear on the podcast and more. Right now, for the holiday season, if you go to www.finegardening.com, you'll find an offer for $15 for an entire year of Fine Gardening Magazine. Now, this holiday sale won't last forever, so hop on to finegardening.com to get a full year of Fine Gardening Magazine for $15. Happy holidays!
Hello and welcome to another episode of Let's Argue About Plants, the podcast for people who love plants, but not always the same ones. I'm Carol Collins. I'm a senior editor at Fine Gardening Magazine, and today I'm joined by my friend Susan Morrison, who is the owner and principal designer for Creative Exteriors Landscape Design. She has designed hundreds of gardens in California's East Bay area, ranging from hillside estates to postage stamp front yards. And Susan has also been a frequent contributor to Fine Gardening Magazine. We most recently featured her home garden in our June 2024 issue. Welcome to the podcast, Susan.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
I was thinking, because not all of our listeners would be familiar with the East Bay area, if you could start by giving us the lay of the land. Like, where are you? What's the climate like? What are your soils like? That kind of thing.
Okay. Well, I live in Concord, California, which is in the East Bay of Northern California. And that means I'm about 25 miles inland from San Francisco. So it's still very temperate here. We're USDA zone 9B, but it can be fairly dramatically different because there's a little bit of a mountain range that separates us. So we get much hotter in summer, particularly since climate change. We have more days over 100 degrees, and we get a little cooler. We can get freezing temperatures in December. And our soil, mostly clay. If we're lucky, it's clay loam, but definitely we have to make some effort with compost to make it a little bit more adaptable to the plants that we like to plant out here.
Interesting. So I was asking you on this podcast to talk about some of your favorite focal point plants, and maybe you could start us off by talking about what qualifies as a focal point plant, and how do you like to use them?
Well, I definitely am a big proponent of focal points. I think that they can add a lot to a garden. And as you know, I'm particularly interested in small space gardens. My own garden is small. A lot of the gardens that I design are small. But to start out, my definition of a focal point is anything that stands out from its surroundings. And that could be because, so you want contrast. So that could be because it's taller. It could be a completely different object, not a plant like a fountain or a piece of statuary. It can be a different color. It can be a different shape. Anything like that would be considered a focal point. And the purpose of the focal point is basically to stop you. Not so much to physically stop you, but to stop the eye, to arrest your experience as you look through a garden or as you walk through a garden. And so the reason that they can be such an awesome tool if you're trying to up your garden design game is they really help you curate the experience that someone has or that you have and how people view the garden. It's almost like you're the garden's director, how you view the garden, how you move through the space. So that's what I consider to be a focal point. And whether or not I would use an object or a plant or how I would use it would definitely depend on what I was trying to accomplish.
Interesting. So let's get right into it. What is your first focal point plant that you'd like to talk about?
All right, so my first focal point plant is an Acer palmatum sangukaku, which is more commonly called a coral bark maple. It's a little bit less of a mouthful. And I love this particular small tree as a focal point for a couple of reasons. One, ideally a focal point is not going to be a one season plant. You would like it to be a focal point for at least 3 seasons and if possible 4 seasons. And sangukaku, I can talk about its cultural conditions a little bit first. It's a moderate water plant. It's pretty hardy. It goes down, I think, to about zone 5 and up to zone 9. The size of it supposedly can get 25 feet tall. I have never seen one that tall. It's usually more of an 18 to 20 foot tall tree. It'll get maybe 12 feet. I don't know why I'm saying that like that's 12 feet, but I'm trying to say it's more narrow, maybe 15 feet wide. And one of the things, and a moderate water tree and average soil. One of the things that I love about it, all Japanese maples are beautiful, but this one has a beautiful 4 season component to it. So in the spring, you're going to get that nice, soft, early green foliage, kind of a chartreuse color, and then that's going to fade out to a more typical green in summer. And then in the fall, you're going to get gold leaves that typically have a little bit of orange to them. But now this is where it really goes its own path versus other Japanese maples. And depending on how quickly it gets cold in your area, so anywhere from mid-fall into winter, the color of the bark turns like a coral burgundy color, which is where it gets its name. And so it's actually an amazing focal point in winter as well. In fact, I think I probably like it best in winter. If you're someone who likes to use landscape lighting, it makes an absolutely gorgeous uplit tree in the wintertime. So in terms of how I would use this, I would use it if I wanted what I call a focal point that leads the eye. Meaning I want something fairly large that's in the middle of the garden or maybe the back of the garden that stops you from moving through too quickly. And one of the reasons in this particular instance where I might choose a tree over an object like a garden statue is if the garden, particularly if it's bigger or the plants are bigger, I want some height. And I mean, I think most residential gardens don't really want a 10-foot tall, maybe you do, if you do go for it, but most don't really want a 10-foot tall statue. And so a tree is a little bit more of a natural effect. And one thing, I just recently found this out, if that scale sounds too big for you, but you love the idea of this plant as a focal point, there's a newer cultivar out called Little Sangu, which only gets about 7 or 8 feet tall, which I'm actually very excited to try. And I might try something like that in a container. So that's my first focal point. That's how I would use it and why I might choose a plant over over an object.
This one is a great one, and what I like about it is that you're recommending it in your area out on, almost coastal California. I just added this one to my Connecticut garden last spring, and it's funny, it was an impulse buy. I was at my local nursery. They were doing a workshop on hamamelis, witch hazels, and I did not buy a witch hazel. I bought this one because it looked so cool. And this was in the spring before any leaves were on it. And it was that bark. And I was waiting in line to buy it. And everyone was asking me what it was.
Oh,
And
yeah. So
yeah.
you've already seen what it's going to look like then in the winter.
Yes. And that's, basically when I bought it. It's such a cool plant. I
Well,
love it.
and I would say if you if you don't have one and you decide to purchase one, and they're usually pretty easy to get, they're popular trees. Japanese maples have a natural, beautiful form, even if you never prune them. But this one, if you do take the time to prune it so that you keep that open shape and don't let it get too much like a lollipop, it's really going to deliver on its beauty potential that way for sure.
Excellent. We have actually got an article about pruning Japanese maples. I will drop that into the show notes for
Great.
listeners.
Great.
So what's your next plant?
So the next plant that I have is an ornamental grass, and it's Miscanthus sinensis, zebrinus, I think that's how you say it, and its more common name is zebra grass. And what I love about this particular plant as a focal point, first of all, I love the texture of it. it's a fountain type of a grass. And so it does have very good contrast from more traditional shrubs and perennials that you might have in your garden. But what makes it really spectacular versus other ornamental grasses is not so much its plumes, but more the color of the foliage. And the reason that it's called zebra grass is because it's not usually when you think about striped, you think about something variegated that's striped like lengthwise, but this one looks like you had this beautiful chartreuse grass and someone took a paintbrush and dipped it into gold paint and then just shook it all over the plant. So you've got these really jazzy sparks of gold all the way down it. And it's pretty hardy. It's zone 5 to zone 9. It's a moderate water plant. If you are in a low water area, it does drought adapt. It will take less water fairly quickly over a few years. And this one as well has a smaller version that's called Little Zebra because it gets big. It gets 7 to 8 feet, which is for a smaller garden, that's going to be a little bit big probably for what you want to accomplish. And the way that I would most likely use this plant is another type of focal point is trying to unify 2 spaces or 3 spaces. And when I say unify space, there's different types of spaces, but in this case, I'm thinking specifically hardscape, like patios. So if I have a garden and I want to have different rooms, I want to have a place to relax, but I also want to have a place maybe to gather and eat dinner, and I want them to feel connected, like your house would feel connected, but I also want them to feel a little separate, I would connect them by having a focal point in between them. And that might be because I have an L shape, it might be because there's a curve. And the goal of that focal point is, again, you're going to want it to look distinct from whatever is around it. And it also needs to look good from all sides. So you want something like an ornamental grass that looks really gorgeous and has a very symmetrical 360-degree shape. In this instance, probably a standalone plant wouldn't be my first choice. I do, in this instance, like the idea of some kind of a man-made object like a container. And I'm trying to think of why. I don't know why. I just know that I would like it. So I would probably be more likely to actually use a container and do a little zebra and get my effect that way. So that's another plant that works fantastic for a focal point.
That's interesting. And if you put it into a container, maybe it reduces the footprint that it would the bigger version would take up.
Yeah.
You still got the height.
100%. So you could either do the little version, or you could actually, you're right, you could also just plant the larger version, and then the container itself would potentially contain the root system for you. Yeah.
Interesting. Okay, that's very cool. So we've had a tree and a grass. What's your next type of focal point that you have for us?
Well, I think I mentioned at the beginning that some of the things that can create a focal point are things that are either a different shape, in particular a very strong architectural shape, or a different color. So my next 2 plants do both of those things, and these are a little bit more geared for warm weather gardens. And the first plant that I have is an agave, and the one that I'm going to talk about in this instance is an agave avatifolia, which is also called whale's tongue agave. And the reason that I love this one is its shape is very consistent. It's a really strong silver. Like all succulents, it's going to be low water. It does like very sharp drainage. So even if you have loamy soil, I would still amend my soil with succulent potting mix just to get it off to a good start. And one of the things I like about this agave and the next plant that I'm going to talk about is, unlike some, or unlike aloes, if you're a succulent fan and you know the difference between these plants, it is very unlikely to pup. So one of the ways that a lot of succulents reproduce is they create little mini versions of themselves that kind of peek out from the bottom of the plant, which is fantastic because that gives you free plants that you can break off and plant. But with an agave, for a lot of them, it's very tight. And so it's extremely difficult to get that plant out. And because it's a focal point plant, I typically like it to be very clean. And so I like an agave or a plant like that that doesn't pup. That's why I like this plant, but other agaves would work as well. A potential negative about this plant is it's not as consistent in how big it gets. If you overwater it, it'll keep growing. It'll get 6 or 7 or 8 feet tall. If you really have a low water garden and you don't give it much water, it'll top out probably more about 4 feet around and get maybe 2.5 feet tall. And then the second plant that I like, if I just scared you off with the fact that I don't know how big it's really going to get, or if you don't want silver, because this is a very bright silver. For some gardens, you might feel like that's too much of a statement and you just don't want to deal with it. The other color that I like to use if I want a more subtle contrast is a chartreuse. And one of my favorite plants for that is a yucca bright star. I think it's yucca gloriosa bright star. And same cultural conditions. It's hardy from maybe 7 to 9, likes the same sharp drainage, very low water. These are lean plants. If you didn't want to put mulch around them or other plants around them, you could just use gravel as mulch. They would be perfectly happy with that. And this yucca also doesn't pup, and it's going to get maybe 3 to 4 feet around. So it's very much a staple in the gardens that I design. And in fact, there's a lot of neighborhoods. I've been doing this for 20 years. So I drive through a lot of neighborhoods that I have gardens in. And I was driving down a street, and out of the corner of my eye, I could just see a garden that had yuccas spotted around it. And I thought, oh, that looks like something I would do. And then I realized, well, I did do it. That's a garden that I designed. So for both of these plants, I would use them to unify the garden as well, but I wouldn't use them so much to unify hardscape. I would use them to unify the garden as a whole. And basically what I'm talking about is using them to get repetition. And repetition in the garden is, I think, a garden design term that all of us are familiar with. But I'm also an avid home gardener and a plant lover. And what I find is the plant lovers don't like repetition because they want to buy as many different plants as they can. And if that's you, if that describes you, if you can pick one strong architectural plant like this, like an agave or like a yucca, like a cordyline maybe, I'm trying to think of a spiky year-round plant that is in a lower zone, but I can't right now. And you plant, depending on how big your garden is, 3 of these, 5 of these, whatever it might be, then that's going to give you the unity that you need, and you're going to have more freedom to go to town on all the other plants around it. And so it's a good strategy for plant lovers who really don't want to conform to the rules of garden design, but still want a beautiful garden.
That's a great idea. And for those of us like that, whale's tongue agave is never going to be winter hardy where I am, but I know that Chanticleer Garden, which is in a similar zone to me, like zone 6, maybe zone 7, they have one that is in a container. They bring it in and out of the greenhouse every year. So if you've got a strong back or a dolly, this is a plant that we could have. It just takes a little more effort for us.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Wow. So what a great group of focal point plants. For the second half of the interview, I was hoping to start with, getting into your background. Like, how did you get into this? Have you always been a plant person?
I really haven't been. My mother liked to garden when I was younger, but for whatever reason, I didn't really catch the bug until I became a homeowner myself. I think that's true for a lot of people. And then I did become interested in plants. And I live in Northern California. I used to live in Southern California. And when we moved here, we bought a new house that had no landscaping at all. And I hired a garden designer to help me. And that's when I caught the bug. And seeing what she did and seeing the creativity to it and being outside. And I thought, I could kind of see that. So I quit my job in marketing and actually went back to school to become a garden designer. And that was, 24 years ago. And that's how I got into it. And I haven't looked back.
Fun career. I mean, do people tell you this is their dream job? Is this something that people say to you?
Yeah, they do. And I think to the point where I have to say, you get that it's work, right? Because it doesn't always seem that way. And particularly if I have clients who are newly retired, I've had more than one new retiree say, do you need an assistant? Do you need help? Because this seems like it's a lot of fun. So I'm not quite at doctor level, but where people, when you meet them at a party, describe all their ailments to you. But if I say I'm a garden designer, I definitely have people start to describe their garden, start to show me pictures. So it's definitely, I think, a universal thing that a lot of people can relate to.
It that and it's a fun way to connect with other people too,
Yes.
isn't it? In your article in issue 217, and we will drop a link into the show notes so listeners can read that article. You talked about the three W's. These are questions that you ask every client as you begin working with them. Could you tell us what those questions are and how they help you with the design process with a new client?
Yes, absolutely. I Some designers will start out with a questionnaire. I'm not really a fan of that. I personally don't love filling them out, and I feel like we all have a different approach, a unique approach to how we see our garden. So I don't have a one size fits all, but I do like to help people get a grip on what's most important to them. And the three W's help me do that because they help to define what I call a lifestyle garden, meaning instead of thinking about your garden as a collection of plants or a collection of spaces, think about what do you want to do when you're outside? And so the three W's kind of help you get there. So the first question is, what will you be doing in your garden or in your backyard or in your space, whatever term you prefer? When will you be outside and who will be with you? And by thinking about those questions, it really helps me understand and helps the understand where we should be putting our emphasis and where we should be putting our budget dollars and how we should be laying things out. So the first question is the most important. What will you be doing outside? And it always sounds really straightforward. Well, of course, I need a patio, I need a place to sit and hang out. But if you entertain a lot, that's going to be a different space than if it's just mostly you and your immediate family. If you like to eat outside, that's going to be a different space than if you mostly want to be hanging outdoors and gardening or maybe sitting around a fire pit in the evenings. And so understanding what you want to do is very helpful. And one of the things that I have found is sometimes, as in many things in life, we have an aspirational garden where we imagine we're going to be doing certain things, but we're really not going to be doing them. So it's also a little bit of a reality check for us. And then the second question, when will you be outside? It's partly what time of the year so that you maximize your plant choices to really have your garden shine when you're outside, but it's also making sure you're going to be comfortable. And that means if you're outside and you're in a hot climate and you like to be out in the middle of the day or in the afternoon, do I have the right shade? If I like to be out at night or if I want to be outside when it's cold and barbecue, do I have lighting? Do I have the right protection? Thinking about those things again helps figure out, how to guide things. And the final question, who will be with you, really takes on not just your immediate family, but also, again, do you entertain a lot or not really? If you entertain a lot, then I'm going to make sure that I have a lot of living spaces and opportunities for seating. But if it's just occasional, then I'm going to come up with strategies where we can bring seating in when we have to, but it doesn't live in our garden permanently. And it's also things, kids are very important, whether you have kids, whether you have grandkids, whether you're hoping you're going to have grandkids, trying to plan the garden so that it works for the people who spend time in it with you.
Yes, and in your home garden, you went through that exercise in the article, and you created a space that's just a perfect hangout. And I was so lucky that I was able to hang out with you in that space and have dinner. Um, your backyard is fairly small, and it's about 30 feet deep and 60 feet wide. Is that
Mm-hmm.
correct? Yeah, but it feels so much more spacious when you're in it. And I was wondering if there are any features or design techniques that you use to make it feel so expansive and in limited space.
Well, I loved having you here, by the way, so I'm glad that you enjoyed your visit. You took some really amazing photographs. Well, first, of course, I did the same thing for myself as I would do with a client, and I started with the three W's. And so that naturally led to a very comfortable organizing principle, which is I will rarely jam all of my living spaces up together. And in fact, I just did a client consult recently where we're not going to be changing the main patio, and it's huge, and I can see that they're only using a little portion of it. So in my case, I didn't even think so much about the main patio. I thought about what my husband and I like to do, which is sit outside in our lounge chairs, and when we like to do it, which is at the end of the day in the evenings. And so that was the first thing that I added, and I sited it so that it had the best possible view of the garden. And then other things that I thought about what we like to do and when we're outside is on the weekends we like to eat lunch outside. And I didn't want to put a big permanent shade structure in because I felt it would be too heavy for my little garden. And so instead, I sited a small little patio in the back of the garden. I think you know we call that the ladies who lunch table because it's designed specifically for lunchtime eating. And because it's in the back, I can take advantage of my neighbor's trees. And so that's another way that I've tried to make the garden feel inviting. And a table like that, because I put a blue focal point wall behind it, also acts as part of my lead the eye focal point. And then just in general, that's obviously specific to us and how we like to enjoy the space. But for anyone, in as much as it is possible, given the amount of space that you have, having more than one space to stop, more than one place to sit. I don't know why I keep doing this. Is in my brain, I can see a garden, so I keep pointing to this thing that I'm the only one imagining right now. But having more than one seating space and maybe connecting them by just a soft, informal path is a really great way to make the garden feel expansive because you can see that it's more than just that one space that you step out on that you can enjoy being in. But because you're not doing just the traditional, here's my square patio and my square lawn and my little fringe of plants, by breaking up your seating areas or breaking up any sort of an activity area, it might be a vegetable garden, you know, anything like that, you make sure that every space has patches of plants, basically has garden around it. Because one of my goals, unless it's super contemporary in any space that I design, is I want to feel like wherever you are, you feel like the garden is hugging you. You feel like the garden is surrounding you. So by breaking that up, you're going to get that effect. And I'm assuming anybody listening to this podcast is already a plant lover. And so you'll appreciate how much more soothing, how much more calming, also how much more exciting it is when everywhere you look, you see plants. And again, for plant lovers, more seating areas means more viewpoints of your garden. So it just allows you to enjoy your garden in new ways versus if you're always just sitting at your dining table right outside your back door.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So and one thing that I think you mentioned in the article too is like you can't see necessarily every single plant from where you're sitting. You know, it makes you get up and go into the garden.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, because you've got a nice amount of layering in the garden, and that my path is decomposed granite. A lot of places in the country call it gold fines. You can do anything, but a more natural material like that, I think, really suits a plant heavy garden. Mm-hmm. And that little path isn't just a way to get to where you want to go. It really encourages you to walk and see, okay, what's new? What wasn't here when I checked out my garden a few weeks ago? And it's also, if you are someone who does like ornaments and statuary, I don't like to go too crazy in a small space, but it's really fun to tuck little things along the path, things you can't see when you first walk into the garden that you discover when you take the time to walk through. And then just one other idea, I sort of alluded to this when I said I have a focal point wall, which is a very fancy way of just saying I have a very simply constructed wood wall that's in front of the wood fence that I've painted a cobalt blue. And when you have a smaller garden, taking advantage of fences, taking advantage of walls, and adding a focal point, adding any sort of garden art that you want to. I also grow some of my succulents in containers on the walls, is another way to make a small garden feel very inviting and to feel, again, that like that garden is all around you, is hugging you.
Mm-hmm. You are a very talented draftsperson and designer, and I'm gonna drop your home back garden site plan into the show notes so people can see it. But I feel like a lot of gardeners resist putting a plan down on paper. Are there any tips that you can share, or anything that you could say to make the process of putting a design on paper less intimidating to the average gardener?
Yeah, I think anything that you don't do on a regular basis can be intimidating. The first thing I would say is it depends on how big of an overhaul you're doing, but the more you're investing in new areas, it is worth it to try to draw something out. And I would say don't worry about perfection, because one of the things that you're trying to do is make sure that your scale is at least roughly correct. So first off, just make it simple. Start with graph paper. Don't feel like you have to measure everything perfectly. Just get it as close as you can. And then what you're trying to do is, if you're putting in new hardscape elements like patios, is you want to make sure, number one, that they're big enough for what you want to do with them. And that's where drawing them out is going to help you, because you're going to need enough room, like for your table and for your chairs, and for people to push their chairs back with and still feel safe, like they're not going to fall off the back of the patio, and for people to walk around. So drawing helps you make sure that you don't make things too small, or conversely, that you just don't know what to do with the space, and so you just make the patio big because you can't think about it. Um, Again, it doesn't have to be perfect. It's a little less crucial to get your planting spaces exact, because as we know, plants aren't going to read whatever you draw anyway. They're going to get as big as they want to get. So perfection is less important there. With my planting areas, when I sketch them out, just make sure that you don't inadvertently make something so small that you can't really grow anything in it. That's a trap that we fall into sometimes. And so just rough, even doing something rough will help you. The follow-up to that, either doing this instead of or in addition to, is I have read before that people will use things like garden hoses, and they'll sort of lay out the space so they can see how big things are going to be, which seems like a great idea. A garden hose seems a little hard to use to me. If depending on what your space is right now, if this is practical, then what I would do, and what I do actually, is get landscape paint from the hardware store, which is paint that's designed to go upside down, and you can actually spray out your main spaces. And I encourage clients, particularly in a smaller space, if I know that the design fits on paper, but I'm not really confident about the feel of it, then I will encourage them, once they have the plan, to actually spray out the patio and pretend to sit on it, put their chairs on it, and say, does this feel right? Does it feel too small? Does it feel like it's too close to your neighbor? Does it feel like it's too far away from the house? And so that's another gut check that you can do that's going to help make sure you don't, put a lot of money into something and then it's in and you think, gosh, this isn't exactly what I was expecting.
Right.
Yeah.
This wouldn't work where you are, but here where we get snow, I found when we first moved in, we didn't have paths or anything. I watched where we walked, and we would make little paths in the snow from where we walked, and that helped guide our design process. Like, where do we actually want, how do we want to get from this spot to that spot? Um, so
That is actually
similar.
we obviously can't do that here. That is actually a brilliant idea, because one of the aspects that I was not as good at when I first started designing, because I just wanted to create these beautiful things on paper, is sometimes my designs would be a little bit too convoluted. And when you're outside, moving through an outdoor space is different from indoors. Indoors, you just want to get, from your comfortable couch to the refrigerator as fast as you can. When you're outside, it is a little bit more about the journey. So it is okay for your paths to be a little bit more meandering. But if you make them too meandering, like if you did something way different than what you did when you walked through the snow, people just don't use them. And then they just say, forget the path. I'm going to cut through the flower bed. I'm going to cut through the lawn. So that's actually a really great idea.
Um, yeah, and I imagine it's the same wherever you are. Just it's just about paying attention, right? Paying
Yep.
attention to what, and that's sort of like your big thesis.
Yep.
Like, how do you use this space? I noticed on your website that one of the components of the design service that you offer is that you put together an interactive plant palette. So the plants that you're recommending, you give them the names, you give them photos. And I imagine this cuts down on the text from clients saying, "What's this one?" Or like, "Is this a weed or what?" Um, is this something that you would recommend people do for themselves? It seems very handy.
It is handy. It's the program that I use. It's a subscription program, but I think it would really be worth it if you're doing a big project. Just to get a trial, do it on a trial basis. The name of the program that I use now is called Plant Master, and I've always provided photos, but in the past it's been really difficult because I didn't necessarily have them myself. I'd have to search them out. Plant Master is amazing because not only does it have at least one and usually multiple pictures of every plant, but it also has all kinds of cultural information, detailed descriptions. It even has reports that you can run that will show, you can see once you've put your palette together what flowers are blooming in a chart form and what months and what colors they are. I'd say the biggest challenge, and not just with Plant Master, this is really any time that you are either choosing plants online or you're trying to communicate with someone else, here's what it is that your garden is going to look like, is that plant photography, oftentimes it either looks really amazing or it looks really like crap. And so what I find is I have to sometimes say to clients, okay, listen, your plan is not going to look that good. Don't expect quite that level of perfection. But then other times I say, this photo does not do this beauty justice. You're going to love it once it's in your garden. So always, that's definitely when you're looking at plant pictures online, look at as many as you can would be would be my advice.
Absolutely. And even better if it's nearby, like in your own neighborhood, right? Because
Yes.
they'll have similar conditions to what you
Well,
have.
yeah, and shopping in your own neighborhood is actually a really great idea. And when people communicate with me in different ways, but taking pictures around their own neighborhood is really a plus. And plus, it helps me understand, even though oftentimes my clients live within, always within 10 miles, 15 miles of me. It helps me understand their microclimate a little bit better. And so, like, okay, well, if this plant is thriving down the street, then and you like it, then that would definitely be something we could include in your garden too.
Excellent. Um, So, if somebody is thinking about hiring a garden designer, I'm sure there are lots of advantages to that, and maybe you can, share, why do people hire a garden designer? But also, are there things that people can do in advance of their first consultation that will prepare them for the design process and maybe get a better, more personalized result?
Yes. Well, first of all, I would say the more prepared you are for that initial consultation, by far and away, the more you're going to get out of it. Some designers will come and do a initial consultation at no charge. I don't. That's my ideas. That's what I sell. So I do charge for it. But I do encourage people to prepare. I don't know if my website link will be in your show notes, but I actually have a downloadable PDF that works. It doesn't have to be with me. This works with anybody who you might want to have come in and meet with you. And it just talks about things to think about in advance. Your style, what your budget is, the types of things you like to do outdoors, all of that. So the other thing that I encourage people to do to prepare is the more photos I can see, the better, because photos are a much better descriptor than when people describe to me what they like. And one of my favorite ways is if clients will start an idea book on Houzz, if you know that site, Houzz. They have a ton of garden photos, both hardscape photos and plant photos. And if someone puts together an idea book, they can invite me to look at it. And one of the things that I tell clients is and this would be true if I designed in another part of the country as well, they don't need to feel constrained by the type of plant, meaning they don't have to just show me California low water gardens. They can show me a garden from anywhere. And even if I can't give them those plants, now I know what they like. And now I can take those ideas and I can translate them into something that works. So that would be a reason to prepare. And again, the more you prepare, it's very important to me that even if for whatever reason we decide not to move forward, and work on a design together, that they feel like, my clients feel like, wow, I got so much out of this hour. This is really helping me understand what my next step should be. And I think your part two was kind of why hire a designer in the first place.
Yeah.
For a couple of reasons. One, if you have an idea of what you want, but you're just not quite sure how to get there, a garden designer is really great in terms of bouncing ideas across, off of, what's that term? Bouncing ideas off of. And so it's important that you get someone who's open to that. I would always start with a phone call to see if, do you get a good vibe from this person before you actually commit to having them come out and meet with you in person. So if you have a pretty strong idea, you just kind of want help getting there, a garden designer is going to take your ideas and hopefully make them better, is going to maybe show you something you never thought about, is going to tell you why, well, this might work, but maybe this would be a little bit better. And so they're very helpful in that respect. And my favorite clients are ones that have taken the time to think about, again, how they want to spend time in the garden, how they picture their lifestyle unfolding in the garden, but haven't spent so much time that they've already decided exactly where everything is going to go. And they really just kind of want me to draw it for them. And then I'd say the second reason is the same reason you would take the time to draw your space out or to map it out in the snow or with a garden hose or with a can of paint. And that's to save money. Because if you do it all on your own, unless you have a lot of expertise in space planning and in choosing hardscape elements and in choosing culturally appropriate plants, not just beautiful plants, but knowing, are these plants all going to work together? Are they going to get to be the right size? You can blow through the amount of money by having to replant your garden or, having to change the hardscape by far than you would have if you had just invested in a garden design in the first place. So I would say if it's a small thing, you're probably okay with a consultation. If you want to do a lot, I would definitely consider bringing in a garden designer.
Great advice. And yeah, there is a lot of value in your experience. You've done hundreds of these, and most of us really only get to do one or maybe two gardens.
Well, and I would add to that because I meet with a lot of clients who actually have a ton of creativity and a lot of really good ideas. Sometimes I'm there and I'm thinking, gosh, they kind of have this under control. I'm not quite sure what I need to do. But I will tell you that even if you have a good eye and you're just naturally a good designer or you have some training, it's much harder when it's your own space. There's something sort of paralyzing about that makes you much more afraid of making a mistake. And I'll tell you that when garden designers design their own garden, it is very common for them to bring in another designer to advise them. And when they have designers over at their house, there's a lot of, what do you think about this space? What would you do here? What do you think about that? So we can all use that extra set of eyes to help us figure out what works best for us.
I absolutely agree. Well, thank you so much for joining us and sharing your knowledge and expertise. We really appreciate it.
It's been a lot of fun. You know me, I love to talk about plants.
And argue about them too, right?